Welcome to our Washington, D.C. studio. We're joined in this episode by Shahid Buttar. He's a leader of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. We're going to be discussing the application of some of the same laws and techniques and rules that were adopted first during the Bush administration after September 11th and continued today by the Obama administration. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Okay. Of course, the Patriot Act, which was passed on October 26, 2001, just weeks after September 11th, and which many members of Congress had never read, a big bill that obviously had been prepared perhaps well in advance of September 11th.
That's right.
Was up for renewal in spring, and you and your organization were campaigning around it. What's going on with the Patriot Act? Why was it extended? In what ways does it have significance for the people of the United States?
So the Patriot Act has been extended for the next 4 years by a Congress that is essentially asleep at the switch at the same time as our executive branch has gone off the rails. The reason that the Patriot Act is a problem is basically that it suspends the Fourth Amendment and parts of the First Amendment as well. These are the parts of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights that at one point in time, when they still had meaning, protected the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, or the right to association and speech and assembly. Each of those rights have been very dramatically curtailed. The Patriot Act, as you described it correctly, was passed in the figurative dead of night without any debate 10 years ago, and it was extended this spring twice, actually, first for just 90 days and then for 4 years with the Obama administration's support. And the abuses are no less grave than they were under the Bush administration, and in fact they've grown a good deal worse. And we could talk about the differences between then and now, but the fact remains, the quick point here is that there has never been in 10 years a transparent, open debate on this problematic law, this unconstitutional law, and how it very viciously degrades the rights and freedoms that have long made this country great.
I mean, the Patriot Act, when looked in sort of context, is part of a growing number of institutions and regulatory and legal changes that circumscribe rights and laws that were considered cherished parts of the American political landscape, including, as you said, the First Amendment, the right to free speech and free assembly, the Fourth Amendment about search and seizure. These are considered, when we're growing up in American schools, to be like sort of the tenets of American democracy. What made the United States different than other countries? Talk, if you would, about how the Fourth Amendment, the search and seizure, the ability of the police to stop people without suspicion of having committed criminal conduct, how that is impacted specifically by the Patriot Act.
Absolutely, and it's a great question. The National Security Letter Authority is an example of a way in which the Patriot Act undermines the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment essentially requires that for the police to stop you or search your home, that they have some suspicion that you as an individual have done something wrong. And the Patriot Act is an example of many more laws since that have basically given the government easier access to what used to be the private information of law-abiding individuals. So national security letters are an example. They're basically an administrative subpoena through which the FBI or other federal government agencies can demand, for instance, the banking information or the medical records of someone without ever demonstrating that that individual has committed any crime or even is predisposed or inclined towards one. And what little we know about the use of these national security letters is that they've been issued in tens of thousands of improper instances. We know that the abuses have expanded under the Obama administration. For instance, national security letters, at least at one point, required a paper trail. Under the Obama administration, there was a change made by the Justice Department, I want to say this was in 2010, where they created a whole new category of letters called exigent letters, which basically are letters promising later formal national security letters that often never came. So whereas before there was at least a paper trail, and when government audits examined the paper trail, they were able to compile reports documenting for Congress pervasive systemic abuse, which incidentally was never fixed. And then under the Obama administration, what has grown even worse then is basically hiding the paper trail so that we can't even now in retrospect establish how severe the violations might be. And the insulation of the intelligence agencies from accountability, the undermining of transparency in favor of executive secrecy. These are all themes that pervade not just Patriot, but also the other government laws that you mentioned, the Attorney General's guidelines, the FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act amendments, And the whole is unfortunately much worse than merely the sum of their nefarious parts.
Well, I want to talk about FISA and the extension or the debate or non-debate about whether the FISA Act should be extended. And I want you to explain what that is. But I want to ask you, from your point of view, what's behind this sort of aggregation of power? Of course, September 11th becomes the pretext, and has been the pretext, the excuse, if you will, for the government doing anything in the name of national security.
That's right.
But why is it? I mean, a lot of people thought that George W. Bush was the problem.
Right.
That this was a tendency by the neoconservatives, by the
right.
Republicans. Now we had Obama, President Obama, the liberals rallied to his cause. There was great hope and euphoria when he came to office. He was not a right-wing Republican. He was not George W. Bush.
Right.
Why is this tendency for the aggregation of executive power at the expense of people's rights? Why is that taking place in America?
Another great question. And to be perfectly honest with you, I couldn't tell you. I have my theories, but I don't think there is.
What's your primary theory?
I go back to President Eisenhower and his departing address in '61 when he warned the United States. Remember, this is the supreme Allied commander in World War II. He's the President of the United States. No one knew better than he that the military-industrial complex was emerging, that there was a confluence, an informal network of, not a conspiracy theory, out in the open, of the regulatory agencies, the oversight committees on the Hill, the defense contractors, the companies that give jobs to Americans because of, in particular at the time, it was weapons procurement and selling weapons abroad. What we've seen in the years since 9/11 is the metastasis of what used to be a military-industrial complex and building an intelligence-industrial complex on top of it. So there is very much a private industry that makes a great deal of money off of surveillance that would be unconstitutional in a prior version of the United States. And I think the emergence of that private industry has really enabled a subversion of the checks and balances that we relied on in the constitutional design to defend our freedom. There's a further problem here, I think, in terms of partisan politics, where you're absolutely right. When President Obama came to D.C., the White House, I should say, a great many people, myself included, thought that there would be some changes. And it demonstrates, many of the same voices on Capitol Hill who were very critical of civil liberties abuses under the Bush administration have gone conspicuously silent when those same abuses are happening under the Obama administration. And the abdication of principle in favor of partisanship, there's another way of looking at this too. Patriot's a less good example. This is in the weeds a little bit, but in 2000, it would have been 2010, in the fall, it was 2009, the year before, in the middle of the healthcare debate, when it takes the Obama administration the better part of a year to convince Congress to try to extend health care to 42 million Americans who lacked it, it took 1 week for both parties in Congress to align and support a White House proposal to amend the FOIA, as the Freedom of Information Act, which was won 30 years ago in response to a citizen victory over the last time an imperial presidency tried to maintain secrecy over a lot of information. They amended the FOIA to give the Defense Department the authority to hide evidence of detainee abuse. And it was an example of, or similarly this summer, there's been a big debate in D.C. about the debt ceiling. And in the midst of this, the FBI director's term was extended for the first time since J. Edgar Hoover. And it was nary a controversy. Barely anybody even heard about this happening. And even though both parties were at loggerheads over health care, at loggerheads over the debt ceiling, when it came to giving the Defense Department the authority to hide evidence of a criminal trail, or in entrenching the FBI's leadership despite the crackdown on free speech, on peace and justice activists around the country, on labor activists around the country, on environmental activists, on Muslims of any ethnicity. Again, the parties in lockstep aligned around the White House, and what were supposed to be independent branches with checks and balances have really supported each other in extending this problematic power.
Yeah, so I want to also get from your point of view where you think this ends then as a consequence. You identified Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address to the nation in January 1961, where he warned of the military-industrial complex. You're asserting that there's a military-industrial sort of surveillance complex, intelligence gathering complex.
Operating here in the United States.
Operating here. and that it's driven partly by commercial interests. In other words, it's a box-checking enterprise, and that if the government is just going to keep writing blank checks basically for this kind of work, a lot of people are going to make money from it. And as you're depicting in Congress, while there's debate and controversy and acrimony over this or that issue on military and now on surveillance and intelligence issues, nary a peep. In other words, basically a consensus. Where does it end? In other words, the United States government tells the rest of the world that the rule of law means that government can't have, or individuals in government can't have unfettered discretion.
Right.
That they're governed by laws. But when you say the government, as you pointed out, the government writes laws that says we exempt ourselves from having to tell the truth, which they're doing.
Every day. Yeah.
Where does it end?
I fear that democracy in America is very much at risk. I just had an opportunity about a week ago to meet a prominent NSA official and National Security Agency former official who was since prosecuted by the Obama Justice Department, the Holder Justice Department, I should say.
And his name?
Thomas Drake. And he released information to a reporter, classified information that did not constitute any breach of national security. It merely revealed government fraud, abuse, and a very controversial decision to use a version of a computer program that did not protect the privacy interests of law-abiding Americans, as opposed to an alternative that would have.
And the purpose of using that was to gather information on them?
This is the FISA Act. This was the NSA's
warrantless
wiretapping.
The secret, what was then a secret wiretapping operation. So Thomas Drake was an NSA official. I think it's important for you to tell the story if you could.
Sure.
So he was a National Security Advisor employee or agency employee, and he said he thinks something illegal is going on, that the government is illegally spying on the people by the use of these tools.
Right.
And that turned out to be the case.
That's right.
That's recognized by the courts and by Congress. And yet,
I wouldn't say that last part. Courts and Congress haven't recognized it. The way this, and I'd say with Thomas, it's interesting to know too. This is a Air Force veteran, Navy reservist. This man had dedicated his life to service to the country. He played by the book. He started his career at the NSA on September 11th, 2001. Was his first day on the job, and he wasn't, it wasn't a private Bradley Manning sort of, a low level private. This was someone who came into the NSA as a senior executive programmer. Basically.
But he thought the government was doing something that was illegal.
That's right.
In terms of spying.
And he shared it with the press, as you're supposed to be able to do under the First Amendment, which ensures freedom of the press. And even though that President Obama has praised government whistleblowers as guardians of the public interest, his administration is prosecuting for national security breaches more whistleblowers than every other administration in U.S. history combined.
So Thomas Drake was fired?
He was fired and prosecuted for 4 years. And on the eve of trial, the Justice Department basically threw its hands up in the air and said, oh, just kidding. We're going to charge him, instead of the espionage crimes that they'd been asserting for 4 years, we're going to charge him with releasing classified information, which is a vastly lesser offense. At the sentencing hearing, in which everyone conceded his guilt of releasing the classified information, the judge castigated not Thomas Drake, but the Justice Department for pursuing so ridiculous a prosecution, wasting government resources, basically to intimidate someone who threw his career under the bus in the service of the public interest. This was a government official who took his oath to the Constitution seriously, and for it, he faced prosecution by a justice system that will not prosecute architects of torture, who continue to enjoy power and prestige in our country, one of whom is himself a judge on an appellate court on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And when you ask the question, where does this go, and how do, for instance, in other countries square the U.S. claim to uphold the rule of law, I think it becomes very hard to accept the American claim to be a land of the free when we are a land of the convenient.
So there's a fundamental double standard from the presentation about the rule of law. I want to ask you about your own organization and what you're doing, because if we see Congress has a near consensus, either because of acquiescence or intimidation in the face of the intelligence gathering, FBI, law enforcement, if the Obama administration, which people had lodged so much hope in, is in fact deepening the same trend and pattern of government power over civil rights, civil liberties, going back again to the question of where does it end, maybe before we get to that question is what can average people do, and what are they doing to weigh in on this, because obviously the American people feel strongly about the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. They may not know about this because it's not the headlines here, but what can people do and what are they doing?
I think the key is to take action in their local communities, and we at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee work with people around the country from all walks of life, students to beauticians to professors, lawyers, members of city councils and mayors, all the way up the chain of command to members of Congress. We work with people to defend our rights. We're basically patriotic Americans who believe in the Constitution. We take the First Amendment seriously, the right to speak, the right to assemble, the right to associate, and these are freedoms that have been compromised, again, not just by one law or by one party here in Washington, but by all of them. And so in the face of that subversion, I would say, of our democratic institutions, we basically organize around nonviolent principles to bring communities together around shared civil rights interests. So for instance, at the moment, we have campaigns that we're supporting in 30 cities around the country to restore the rule of law vis-a-vis local law enforcement agencies. So these basically look like restrictions on police to restore the right to speak. Requirements that say if the local police, if the District of Columbia police want to infiltrate a meeting of an activist group, they have to at least have some suspicion that someone's done something wrong. At the moment, that's not true. The FBI is asserting around the country the right to infiltrate any group basically on the assertion of what it calls a proper purpose. So if the FBI writes in a book that the reason it was doing whatever related to national security, they can do whatever they want. They disclaim any limits on their authority. And
well, let me ask you about this, too, because there are many reports that in addition to surveilling, the government or some in various government agencies are actually implanting their own agents, undercover agents, either in political groups, political meetings, discussions about demonstrations, or in religious organizations such as mosques. And then frequently, the agent is the one who is speaking most provocatively, suggesting the most outrageous thing, largely rejected by the rest of the people in the room. But that becomes the basis to trigger an investigation where the FBI or others then say, well, there is suspicion because there's the suggestion of violence or illegal activity, but they are the ones who actually did it.
That's right.
Is that something that your organization is noticing?
Absolutely. No, we've been on this, I wouldn't say from the start, because this problem unfortunately goes back 40, 50 years in America, and we were only founded 10 years ago. But yes, absolutely. We just wrote a letter to the Hill, two, in fact, this year, one on behalf of 40 organizations, asking members of Congress to reject the extension of the FBI director's term for precisely that reason. And we cited other instances of FBI abuses beyond that. There's an issue with respect to the FBI using immigrants as bait to convince the rest of the country to resign our rights.
How does that happen? How does specify how that happens?
Yeah. Well, maybe if I can talk a little bit about the infiltration, and then I'll pivot. Yeah. So there happens to be a case at the moment in Southern California, Los Angeles, by several groups, including the ACLU, alleging on the basis of another government whistleblower's testimony that the FBI did exactly what you described. They paid an ex-convict $100,000 to go into a series of mosques across Southern California and basically bribe people to participate in plots. And when nobody did, and in fact many of the congregants in those mosques went to the authorities and said, there's someone preaching violence here, and those individuals in some cases are now serving sentences for terrorism-related offenses, particularly because they declined to serve as informants. And when the FBI interrogated them about various issues, including, for instance, the dates of their international travel, in one particular case, an individual failed to cite one of his trips. And because he lied to a federal agent, that was the basis for a felony.
So if you lie even inadvertently, if you say I went to 20 cities and you
really went to 21.
Went to 21.
That's right. That's a federal crime. It's a felony. And it just so happens that lying to a federal agent is the crime in the terrorism arena of which the Justice Department has secured the most convictions, which is to say most counterterrorism prosecutions don't have anything to do with terrorism. They're just about somebody lying to a federal agent, and it can happen by mere omission. It can be inadvertent. And it's interesting, too, that in this case, the people that the FBI went after were the ones who did exactly what we're supposed to do. You hear about somebody promoting violence, what are you told to do? Go to the authorities. So these people did that. and they've been prosecuted. Thomas Drake did everything he's supposed to do. He took an oath to the Constitution. He followed his oath. What happened to him? He got prosecuted. So you see this sort of consistent pattern of people facing penalties for things that aren't wrong. And the same thing is true then in this biometric piece with the using immigrants as bait. So what that looks like is a program called the Secure Communities Initiative. And it specifically is a program to share fingerprint data between local police and federal officials. What we knew until about a month ago was that where around the country local jurisdictions started passing laws saying you, our local police, the D.C. Metro, may not give to the federal immigration authorities this fingerprint data, we'd seen the FBI step in and say, okay, well, we'll take the arrest data and we'll give it to the immigration authorities. Well, so what we discovered in the last month was that the FBI not only emerged after the fact as a go-between to give cover to the immigration officials, but actually helped craft the program at the outset, developed and documented a political strategy to force it down the throats of local jurisdictions across the country. Even
and that's
over
the secure communities.
That's right, secure communities. And it's been very controversial in the Latino immigrant community for sparking what I think many have rightly called a humanitarian crisis. Under the Obama administration, there have been more deportations of undocumented Americans than ever before in U.S. history. Nearly half a million undocumented Americans were deported last year. And what's interesting about this is Secure Communities is sold to the public as a program to deport immigrants who are undocumented and who commit crimes. What it actually is a deportation program for anyone who is suspected of a crime before they ever see a judge on an offense, or however trivial the offense. And so the tagline for Secure Communities that I like to use is breaking up families over broken taillights, and that's exactly what we've been doing for years. It gets worse, though, because not only did the FBI help develop this program, but they have more in store. And they developed this program consciously as the thin edge of a wedge to normalize biometric data collection, not just for immigrants, but for all Americans. And so what the FBI basically did was use a political strategy to hang immigrants out as the bait to get the rest of America to consent to pervasive biometric data collection. And what the Bureau has in mind, the NGI, the Next Generation Initiative, is the creation of a national ID system using our bodies instead of cards as the way to identify, track, and locate people. And it's deeply terrifying.
We see the U.S. government uses that technology, correct me if I'm wrong, all over Afghanistan.
That's right.
There's a huge number of Afghans, particularly Afghan males between a certain age, who, their faces are opened up.
That's right.
They're taking biometric photography. They're then using it to trace people's movements, and then from time to time that information is relayed to Virginia, where there's a headquarters where living human beings who are working for the CIA are detecting what they consider to be the movement of enemy forces and then ordering drone air attacks. And large numbers of civilians and others are being killed in Afghanistan. So there's this integration of an aggregation of data collection that's being used for all sorts of purposes.
That's
but
right.
Now what you're saying is that, and you believe, I guess, that this is, from the point of view of law enforcement, the next phase for the United States itself, not for the battlefield, and not simply for immigrants who are a targeted population, or, at least the immigrant population feels targeted. But you're saying you believe these are precedent-setting acts that will be used throughout the country.
The only dissent I would have is I wouldn't say this is my belief. This is documented. So unfortunately, that is unassailably true. And I do think that the very fabric of what America means is slipping between our fingers in a time of relative peace. I mean, I understand that there are global conflicts and we're at war on multiple fronts, but this is nothing like World War II. It's nothing like the Civil War, right? I mean, life goes on as normal every day outside.
Documented where? When you say that it's not just your belief.
There were the Center for Constitutional Rights and the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, along with an immigration rights clinic at the Cardozo Law School in New York City, together sued ICE and the FBI under the Freedom of Information Act, and they uncovered a treasure trove of documents that they just released, I want to say early to mid-July. So it's only been out for a few weeks, and these are government documents where this is all laid out. And this was secret at the time, like a great many other things that it took somebody to sue the government to get. And when you look at the documents of this program, the NGI, the Next Generation Initiative, is laid out in plain sight. Two pieces I do want to stress, one going back in a conversation and the other forward. The first, just a few minutes ago, we were talking about the military-industrial complex and the intelligence-industrial complex and the use of battlefield technology on unsuspecting Americans here at home is a perfect example of how the military-industrial complex has grown into a whole new arena. And it's interesting, you'd mentioned drones in particular. Drone aircraft are another example of a battlefield technology that is increasingly being deployed here in the United States. There are several sheriff's offices in the mountains in the West and Texas where there are drones flying now as surveillance devices to monitor Americans. Driver's license plate scanners developed for Iraq in particular are being rolled out in police departments all around the country here. And the idea that we are basically developing technology for the military that we are now rolling out through government grants through the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice into local police departments, and that there's no distinction being made between people who've done anything wrong and people who are just minding their business is very dramatically threatening to transform our country into something very different and darker than it has been.
Shahid Buttar, we have about 75 seconds. Showing the time really does fly on important discussions. You're painting a pretty grim picture of what's coming because it's not in the future, it's not contingency planning, it's happening perhaps incrementally but with a certain dynamism. In the last 60 seconds or so, tell us what your organization intends to do and with whom as partners and allies.
We fight the battle city by city, and we do it by bringing people together across different groups. So Latinos, African Americans, South Asians, Arabs, Muslims of all ethnicities, any kind of political dissident, we all share interests in these constitutional rights. And so by organizing across these different communities at the local level, where groups are nimble, not institutionalized, where there aren't Titanics that we have to turn, but they're nimble, smaller groups, we're challenging this national security surveillance state in city councils and state legislatures around the country to build a movement that can defend our rights here in D.C. And we can find, we're happy to share more information with folks online. We can be found at www.bordc, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, bordc.org.
Okay, I want to thank you very much for joining us. This is not a discussion that's ever present in the corporate-owned media, but it certainly will be on the minds of people in the United States and have an impact not just on this, but in future generations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you bringing me on.
That's it for this time. We'll see you next time.